Hello and welcome. This is Mark Dempsey, the National Convergence Technology Center. Thanks for joining us for part 2 of our special Inclusion Summit webinars. One of the goals of our CTC grant is to leverage the best practices of national leaders, like our presenter today, in recruiting and retaining underrepresented populations. We hope this webinar will provide you with some new ideas for successfully retaining women in your program by strengthening classroom inclusion. Our presenter today is Dr. Colleen Lewis from Harvey College in California. By the way, Colleen is very involved with NCWIT. That's the National Center for Women in Information Technology. If your program is not already a member of their academic alliance, it should be. The cost is free and you get access to all kinds of resources and tools, plus an invitation to their annual summit meeting. The website is ncwit.org. Now we'll turn it over to Colleen.
I'm Colleen. I work at Harvey College and I'm a computer science professor. And I study how people learn computer science and how people feel about learning computer science. This is at the K-12 level and at the college level. And particularly my work focuses on equity and inclusion. And so I think there are pieces about the community college context that I don't understand. And so I think that I have a bunch of times during the talk where I say, what questions do you have? And I think we can use the chat window and we can use just having you unmute yourself to share a perspective or to share a question or a challenge and stuff like that. I also posted in the chat thing a link to the slides, and the slides are just in Google Docs, and so actually you can add comments within the slides in case you have a question, and I can get to those. For questions that come to you in today's moment, I think typing it into the chat box would be helpful, but I'm happy to share additional references as come up, etc. Okay, so one of the things that came up in Pam's talk was the NCWIT, National Center for Women in Information Technology. They've got a bunch of great stuff. Another thing that came up in Pam's talk was this need to develop nice looking design stuff for recruitment, and I've used 99 Designs, and it's just a very low cost sort of crowdsourcing thing. So I'll show you some of the stuff that I've gotten designed with 99 Designs, but I don't have a team on campus that can do that, and so this is in the $200 range per piece, which I've been really happy with. The counselors for computing. So Pam mentioned how important these counselors are and other decision makers in students' lives in terms of where they head in college, what courses they select to take, and the power of even having one counselor who is an advocate for your program is helping you recruit and select the right students is really powerful. And Counselors for Computing has a ton of resources about that. And then a piece that came up is, people might say things like, oh, women are great collaborators, and how do you engage with people with this type of bias, or and even seemingly positive statements. And you're like, Colleen, you're supposed to be talking about teaching. I know, but I just have a few more things from Pam's talk that I wanted to enter. And I think it's really important to push people and be like, oh, what evidence do you have for this pattern? And are you imagining non-overlapping bell curves? And that might be kind of problematic. And so another resource from the National Center for Women in Information Technology is the Critical Listening Guide. And they have a bunch of resources where it gives you these statements that people say that embed some bias, maybe benevolent sexism in them there, and it helps you deconstruct those and plan out how you might respond. Okay. Questions about any of this? Let me pull up the chat window so I can see that too.
Not yet, I don't think.
Okay. Yeah, but feel free. Okay, yeah, it won't let me pull up the chat window, so let's see. Cool. All right, so now this is actually what I was planning on talking about. So I have an NSF-funded project, csteachingtips.org, and it has tips for teaching computer science. So you can see our homepage here, and we have these curated sets of tips around reducing bias, department inclusivity, lecturing. I'm going to talk through some of these tips of thinking about strategies that have differential impact in the classroom in terms of creating an inclusive environment. We also have videos for all of these. So I actually kind of imagine that the people on this call, I'm preaching to the choir. Do you know what I mean? If you're watching this video, you are a change maker within your organization. You're not oh, maybe I want to be an inclusive teacher. Do you know what I mean? I just think that's not who's on this call. And so I want to provide resources that are helpful to you in doing the advocacy work in your institution, in improving your own practice. But I imagine that we've really got change makers on the call. So I want to really try and meet your needs. So we've got videos, we've got 1,300 tips online, and here's the, sorry, And then we tweet out 3 tips a day. And so you can see from these examples, emphasize that it's never too late to get help, and encourage students to ask questions about homework assignments because other students might have the same question. And you're like, Colleen, I thought this was csteachingtips.org. And it is, but you notice here that these are not particularly CS relevant. Like, they're just relevant to everything. And STEM, not STEM, these are just teaching tips. And so I think, I hope that actually there's quite a bit that's useful to you, and there's very few resources on csteachingtips.org that are CS specific. Okay. So we talk a lot about the leaky pipeline. And so, where are we losing students? And I want to talk about a piece in thinking about that leaky pipeline. And this is more of a philosophy that I'm bringing to the work. So here's some data I'm a computer scientist. And so this is my context is from the Capor Center for Social Impact. They note that 82% of bachelor's degrees in the US are earned by men, while only 18% are earned by women, and then only 20% are Black or Latinx. And the U.S. population is, I think, 28.4% Black and or Latinx. And then low-income students and students of color are 12 times less likely to have access to CS in their high school. And here they define students of color as Black, Latinx, or Native or Indigenous students. And I think this data is really important for me in thinking about this work, because when I talk to people about the patterns in STEM or in computer science in terms of who's earning degrees, sometimes there's an assumption, and a false assumption, that's just like, oh, women just aren't interested in this work. Black and Latinx students just aren't interested in tech. And it's just like, oh, no, maybe there are differential educational opportunities that are provided to them, differential encouragement to participate, like the stuff Pam was talking about. And that explains the patterns. And in general, when you have a leaky pipe in your home, you don't blame the water. And so we as educators, we as change makers within educational institutions need to be thinking about what are the ways in which we can fix the pipe. And I really liked that question about, okay, so Pam's going to help us on recruitment. How do we retain and support these students? And I'm going to be trying to provide you some strategies for retain and support these students. But I think it's really important that when we are unsuccessful retaining and supporting these students, that we see that as exactly that. It's not a failing of the students. There are going to be students who have a context where, for the need to care for a family member, they can't complete the semester or quarter. There are going to be external contexts, but in general, we want to think about what are ways at which our institution can change and to fill these leaky spots in the pipeline. Okay, any questions at this point? Or what questions do you have at this point? Mm-hmm.
I think we're still good so far. Yeah. No questions yet.
Cool. Yeah, I'm ready for you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking you through some of these strategies from our tip sheet, Tips for Reducing Bias, and this is all available on csteachingtips.org. And if you're running a workshop or anything where you want to pass these out, you can just drop me an email, and I'm happy to mail copies of this to you. So sort of whatever would be most helpful to you. Okay. Excuse me. So the first one is about making your expectations explicit. So I think Pam hit on this, of that, sometimes academic institutions make assumptions about what students know about navigating academic institutions. And there's some work that's referred to as transparent teaching. And actually, none of these ideas are going to be surprising to you, but it's just the idea that you should be really explicit with students about what you want them to learn, what they should do, and how you'll grade them. The extent to which success in a faculty member's class requires some kind of mind reading is not great. Even just in college, one of my friends was like, oh, we're going to do the odd problems in the math book. And I was like, oh, we are? And she's like, yeah, that's how we're going to study for this test. And I was like, oh, studying for tests. Like, even having parents with a college degree, I didn't have some of these skills that I actually needed to be successful. And so thinking about making that explicit for students is really important. And then the results that they're finding is that in faculty making just 2 homework assignments in their class, excuse me, sorry, just making 2 homework assignments more transparent about what they're learning, what they should do, and how they'll be graded. There was a differential impact for students who were first-generation college students, low income, or underrepresented minority. And that typically includes Black, Latinx, and Native students. And this was really helpful for the students' academic confidence, sense of belonging. Pam mentioned how important the sense of belonging is, and then their experience and perception of mastering important skills. So this transparency is a really high leverage point for making our classrooms more accessible. And I think it's really nice because if I can get a faculty member to change a homework assignment, likely they're reusing some of these homework assignments. And now if it's explicit that, when you're done with the homework, you might try the odd problems in the back of the book. That can be really helpful. You might watch these videos online. Another piece is grading anonymously. And this doesn't have to be heavyweight. So I use a system called GradeScope that allows me to grade things anonymously. But when I give a paper exam, before I was using GradeScope, I would just have students write their name on the back of the exam so that as I was just generally flipping through grading it, I just never would happen to see their name. And then I don't look. So at the end, once I'm done grading the exams, I look at the students and try and identify match names with mistakes and misconceptions so that I can understand that. But in the actual process of grading, I grade it anonymously. And I'm guessing that a lot of people have seen this type of work that motivates, for me, the goal of grading anonymously. So it's this unconscious, unintentional bias, again, or this implicit bias that Pam mentioned. And this is just like tons and tons of studies where they've taken a resume, 2 copies of the same resume, and then put different names on it. And then they look at differential rates of response and differential rates of the ways in which, or like the extent to which the person should be hired or how much money they should make and stuff like that. And if you're like, Colleen, I want to know all the studies about this, like I'm happy to send you a list of all the studies. Okay. So I want to look at one that particularly motivates my anonymous grading. So this one, they took some flawed legal writing and sent it to law firm partners. And everyone they told it was written by this person, Thomas Mayer, and he was a third-year associate who went to NYU Law School. And then for half of the lawyers, they said, oh, Thomas is a white man. And for half, they said, oh, Thomas is an African-American or a Black man. And then they looked at how many of the intentional errors in these identical copies of the writing the lawyers found, and they found that when the lawyers thought that the person was Black, they found more of the intentional spelling and grammar errors, more of the intentional technical errors, and more of the intentional factual errors. So the errors were in their intentionally identical copies, and they just were more vigilant and saw more of them when they perceived the person as Black. And so I just think, like, after reading like one of these types of studies, I was like, oh, but this isn't me. Like, I wouldn't do these things. I'm a good person. But then I read a second one and a third one and a fourth one and a fifth one. And then I went to Harvard's implicit association test. And I thought, oh gosh, maybe there's no reason to believe that I am free from these biases. As a white person, I am might be more critical of my Black and Latinx students because of these negative stereotypes, these negative false stereotypes about the intellectual competence of my students who are Black and Latinx. And I wish that I would not replicate the patterns as a woman that are around the negative stereotype about women's intellectual competence. But even as a woman, I can't claim that I'm different and apart from these patterns. And I find that discouraging, but also just really important to recognize. So grade anonymously is like the short answer. And then here's the description of how these lawyers described the writing. If it was a white person, they said generally good, has potential, good analytic skills. If they thought the person was Black or Black or African American, needs a lot of work, can't believe he went to NYU, average at best. And these people aren't bad people. There is unconscious, unintentional biases that are shaping their attention to these problems and critiques in the writing. One of the things that came up in the previous call was thinking about, is it easier for Black and Latinx students to get jobs in tech? And I think this one is really tricky. And I actually have a game where you pull cards that say things like this, or women are great collaborators, or, she only got the job because she's a woman. So I have, actually, I think it's helpful to see it. CS teaching tips, tip sheets. So on csteachingtips.org, I've got this CS Teaching Tips game downloads, and you can download these printable cards. That just is you can download these printable cards and print them out or edit them. There's PowerPoint files, so that this is like if you've played Apples to Apples or Cards Against Humanity. So someone reads the card like, women need family-friendly work environments, and then everyone goes around and says what they say. Like I might say, oh, that's a good point, because actually women are the only humans that have families. So you might use sarcasm like I did, or you might practice responding in like more direct ways. Okay. So here we are back here. So this is a resource for sort of addressing when you hear things like this. And in particular on this one, when people say stuff like this, I do appreciate the initiatives from tech companies to try and really focus on diversity and value diversity and understand that as important. But I think it can create a problematic narrative for students that they believe they only got the job because they're Black or Latinx. They only got the job because they're a woman or a white woman. And I like to push back and say, oh, are there reasons in which it might actually be more difficult for a Black or Latinx student to get noticed or to get their resume recognized as having potential? And there I bring in this knowledge of the unconscious unintentional bias, or this implicit bias, like the research I just mentioned. And so I think we want to be enriching these conversations with sort of that context and background. Okay, hit me with some questions or concerns, or like, Colleen, I hope you talk about blank. Anyone?
There is one, Colleen. So someone asked, how can you grade anonymously if you're using a system like Canvas, or it's coming in, on the internet?
Oh yeah, if it's coming in on the internet. So one of the things I'll do is I'll have students not put their name on, like say they're submitting a document, I'll have them put their name at the bottom or not on it because they're submitting it online. And then also for my systems, when I've used like, I forget what the name of these silly systems are, but one thing that I'll do that's a little bit silly is I'll take a small Post-it note and I'll put it on the spot on my screen where the student's name always shows up. And if that's in like kind of a consistent place, just when I'm grading, it's there. And like, obviously I could remove the Post-it note and see their name. Do you know what I mean? But I don't want to see the name. And even just having a small Post-it note over it helps me not see it. But so different, like you don't need to institute something that is 1,000% foolproof. Do you know what I mean? That's not the goal. And if you accidentally see their name, that's fine. Just in general, if you grade more of the work without looking at their names, that's better. Other questions or concerns?
Well, someone also mentioned you have a lot of great resources. The NCWIT and that C4C. Do you have a centralized sort of list of all these resources, like a list of websites?
So I shared a link to the slides, and actually tomorrow what I'll do is I'll actually just like add all the URLs directly. In general, when you click on the slides, you should be able to you can go and look at the slides to grab them. So I won't be able to get to, I'm traveling today, so I won't be able to get to it until tomorrow, but I can add those. And if there's any individual resources you want, please email me. My email is lewis@hmcharveymudcollege.edu.
Okay, great, thank you.
And then the tricky thing is on csteachingtips.org, we have 1,300 tips. Do you know what I mean? But that's like more than you want. You might just want the tips that are in here. But also csteachingtips.org has the csteachingtips.org. It has these PDFs that we're like sort of walking through. That's going to load very slowly, so we'll pretend we didn't try to go there. Oh, and I see that I've got 2 people in the slides. So that's great. Okay. Let me keep going in there, but keep typing in those questions, and I'm happy to just be interrupted. You could just unmute yourself and ask. I'm really excited about that. So another piece in reducing bias in the classroom and making it more accessible is establishing clear policies. So I think about this, I get a lot of special requests. And so I internally maintain a list of sort of rules. Like if you tell me you're sick, I just believe you. Do you know what I mean? And so then I'm not I'm not making a split-second decision based upon the student and might unintentionally be based upon the student's identity. So they did a study recently where they emailed faculty pretending to be potential grad students, and they had 4 different names that they used. And one was Brad Anderson, and it was the only name that would be perceived as like the white person or the white man. And people email response, they responded more quickly, and they responded more frequently when it was a Brad Anderson. And so I think this knowledge that I would be unconsciously and unintentionally like responding in different ways to people, I think is super important. So I establish clear policies. I might not tell students about all these policies, but I do make it explicit that students can request extensions or whatever, so that everyone knows they can ask and they don't necessarily know what my policy is behind that I'm just always give a 2-day extension or whatever. Acknowledge and manage your bias. I think this is really important. So even for those of us who have dimensions of our identity that get marginalized or face bias or discrimination, there are likely dimensions of our identity that are privileged, and that dimension of our identity doesn't get bias or discrimination. And here I think it's really important to recognize, so as a white woman who's able-bodied and married to a man, I think it's really important to think about the narrowness that provides in my perspective, and how I really need to learn about racism and Islamophobia and transphobia and heteronormativity and homophobia. Like, I need to learn about these things because my own experience doesn't provide that knowledge. And then I have a few resources to recommend. So I love this book by Ijoma Uluo, So You Want to Talk About Race. I think it's a great read and super helpful. Another one that I really like is Stamped from the Beginning. So we talk a lot at my institution about the ways in which we talk about intersectionality. So just if I want to understand the experiences of Black women, it's not enough to understand the experiences of white women and Black men. They're not just added. And what this book does is it helps understand the source of these racist ideas and the source of the intersections of race and gender in some of these ideas and stereotypes that are currently in existence, and how they came from people who were writing in the 1600s and the 1700s and the 1800s, and how they've evolved and exist in our current set of stereotypes. I think it's really a helpful read. And then listening to students' experience. So this is like the teach a person to fish kind of one. So, the question came up for Pam of, once we have students in the program, how can we be meeting their needs? And the extent to which you're surveying students, the extent to which there's a point person that students, when they're experiencing difficulties, sort of would know to go to, or if they have a negative experience, they would know to go to, like, really using that source of information to try and improve your program and identify, we could improve this or we could improve that. And based upon student feedback, like, what is the highest priority for us to address? Okay, so that was our tip sheet, and we're going to pause for questions again. That was our tip sheets for responding to bias and to addressing bias and reducing bias in the classroom. And then I've got a few more pieces to talk about. Questions?
So Colleen, I have a question. This is Mark.
Yeah.
So that one card had, you have something racist in your teeth. What does that mean? What's the story behind that?
Oh, did I skip that? Oh, thank you. The slides sometimes skip over. That's perfect. I missed one piece of acknowledging and managing your bias. Thank you. Let's watch this video. I'm sorry, this is what I had planned originally, but then missed. Mark, well played, thank you. And let me move this so I can make it bigger. And there's closed captioning, just in case you can't hear.
The problem with that all or nothing binary is it causes us to look at racism and prejudice as if they are akin to having tonsils. Like, you either have tonsils or you don't. And if you've had your prejudice removed, you never need to consider. So if someone says, I think you may have a little unconscious prejudice, you say, no, my prejudice was removed in 2005. I went to see that movie Crash. It's all good. But that's not how these things work. When you go through your day-to-day lives, there are all of these mass media and social stimuli, as well as processes that we all have inside our brains that we're not aware of, that cause us to build up little pockets of prejudice every day, just like plaque develops on our teeth. So we need to move away from the tonsils paradigm of race discourse towards the dental hygiene paradigm of race discourse. Which basically, if I could offer one piece of advice. And in general, I think we need to move away from the premise that being a good person is a fixed, immutable characteristic, and shift towards seeing being good as a practice. And it is a practice that we carry out by engaging with our imperfections. So we need to shift towards thinking of being a good person the same way we think of being a clean person. Being a clean person is something that you maintain and work on every day. We don't assume that I'm a clean person, therefore I don't need to brush my teeth. And when someone suggests to us that we've got something stuck in our teeth, we don't say, well, what do you, I have something stuck in my teeth, I'm a clean person. Why would you? So I know that this is no small task, but if we can shift a little bit closer towards viewing those race conversations the same way we view a conversation about something stuck in our teeth, it will go a long way towards making our conversations a bit smoother and allow us to work together on bigger issues around race, because there are a lot of, beyond the persistent conversational awkwardness of race, there are persistent systemic and institutional issues around race that are not caused by conversation, and they can't be entirely solved by conversation. You can't talk them away, but we need people to work together and coordinate and communicate to find strategies to work on those systemic issues, because despite all of the barriers that we've broken, all of the apparent markers of progress, there are still so many disparities if you look at.
Okay. Mark, again, thank you for drawing my attention to having accidentally skipped that. This is a TED Talk by Jay Smooth that I think is really helpful and really pushes my thinking in thinking about managing my own bias as a daily practice. And so thinking about what are the things that are a daily practice for me in managing those biases. And, I think this went out in Mark's email, but this idea of this like a longer term survey that you're going to be doing. And so the idea is after today's call, either some ideas from Pam's talk or my talk or some combination of the two is really pushing you to say, is there something that you could be working on over the next few months? What are some concrete things that you could be doing? And I think this idea of a daily practice is a really important one. In thinking about slowing ourselves down when we're evaluating people, thinking, being conscious of the ways in which people are interacting us because of our race or gender or or ethnicity or sexuality. I want us to push towards thinking about creating personal change in these daily practices and institutional change in our classrooms and at our institutions. Mark, again, thank you. Okay, so we got the book recommendations, listening to students' experiences, questions at this point. And I think this piece, while you're forming your question, I think this piece of pushing past this good-bad binary is really important, because if I think that I'm a good person, then maybe I think that I can never have a negative impact. But that's false. Like, we have these unconscious, unintentional biases. I can have negative impact. I can say things that are hurtful. It's not that I mean to say things that are hurtful. That would be bad. But I can say things that are hurtful and still be a good person. And I think this daily practice helps with that idea. Okay, questions?
Not yet. No, we're still good.
Okay, yeah.
Can I add in a note to Colleen of, do you all notice how she phrased her question? She didn't say, do you have any, or are there any questions which could make someone feel self-conscious? She has, what questions do you have? So she's assuming people will have questions. It's a classroom strategy you can use.
Yeah, I love it. And you can add that to your list of things that you want to start using. Yeah. And did you notice that in the beginning, I accidentally said, do you have any questions? But then I was like, no, Colleen, read the slide. Sorry. Yeah. So I make mistakes on a lot of these all the times, but I think, like Pam said earlier about like, oh, you don't know what the FAFSA is, or like, I assume you know what the FAFSA is. And the subtle cues that we send to students about whether or not we are designing their educational system for them to be successful? Is it assuming their content knowledge? Yeah. Okay, I'll keep going, but feel free to interrupt me. And feel free to start taking notes about, are there strategies or are there daily practices that you want to start using? Okay, yeah, we accidentally went ahead a slide. Okay, cool. So here we go. I've got some tips for lecturing. So this is actually another set of 7 tips around lecturing. And lecturing is a little bit of a misnomer, because actually the first one is to encourage people to integrate active learning. And I would guess if I could see people's faces, I would get some nods to be like, oh, yeah, active learning, like we're doing that for sure. But this idea that even just having a 2-minute break every 20 minutes in lecture can increase students' learning and increase students' retention, I think is a helpful encouragement for active learning. And so again, active learning is a little bit poorly defined. So it's just anything that's not just lecture. And so often this is having students try to apply what they're learning in class. This can be really great. So as an instructor, I get feedback on what they're understanding. It can be helpful so that students don't have to stay engrossed in what I'm saying and tracking me, even as they lose attention span. It provides sort of a natural break. It provides opportunities for students to collaborate and talk during class. I want students not just to be able to perform on a written test or perform on a computerized test or homework. I want them to be able to talk about the computer science ideas that are in our class. And so by doing active learning where students get to talk, I also can achieve that learning goal. And then the extent to which STEM is stereotyped as a solitary act that requires innate brilliance, I can push back against that by emphasizing the importance of collaboration, not just for learning, but for my discipline in general. And then Freeman et al. Did a meta-analysis of active learning, and they looked at 225 studies. And the lecture-only section, so that's the non-active learning, had lower exams scores by 0.64 standard deviation, which I think is huge. And students were 1.5 times more likely to fail. And these results tend to be active learning tends to be more impactful for first-generation college students, students of color, and women, particularly women in STEM fields. I've got another pause for questions. And I actually think I missed 2 others. Oh, no. Oh, cool. Where did those slides go? Cool. I missed 2 other slides that I thought I had pasted in here. Sorry. You're like, Colleen, get it together. Other questions? And I think particularly because you're like, Colleen, you do not work at a community college. You didn't attend a community college. Your work is not relevant for us because you don't understand X dimension of our context. I think the extent to which you could add that contribution to the webinar, I think can help us get perspectives and strategies from other people on the call who don't have sort of my narrow perspective, right? I'm trying to share and summarize and synthesize the research for you, but I think people on this call have a lot that they could add in terms of what I might be missing. And we'll come back, but if you want to hop in, just add a little note to Mark or just unmute yourself. Okay, so my next tip sheet is around encouraging students to seek help. I think this is really important, particularly for first-generation college students, of knowing that seeking help doesn't mean that they don't belong, and it doesn't mean it's a weakness, it's an expectation. Just like in high school, they knew they were supposed to go to class. In college, we need them to know that they're supposed to go to class and they're supposed to ask for help, that those are the normal things that people do in college. It's as expected as going to class was in high school. And so one of the strategies I use for this is reminding students about resources. And I might do this in every class. So just every class, I can have a slide that says, you're going to get stuck. I know that. And here's what you're going to do when you get stuck. You're going to post on our discussion forum or Piazza. You're going to go to these office hours. Here's where the office hours are. It's the extent to which I can use 20 seconds in every class to try and normalize needing help, I think can be helpful for actually encouraging that participation. And there are 6 more tips, but I want to talk a little bit more about why this this encouraging help seeking and destigmatizing help seeking is so important. So maybe people are familiar with the growth or fixed mindset. So this is a book by Carol Dweck, Mindset, the New Psychology of Success. I think this is probably familiar to people, but I won't assume that everyone knows it. So a growth mindset is this idea that your mind is like a muscle and it can grow and get stronger and learn, and challenge isn't a bad sign. It just means that you're getting stronger. And then there's a fixed mindset where there's an innate ability for this thing and you've either got it or you don't. And challenge is actually a signal that you don't have it. And so we need students to adopt a growth mindset because it can encourage them to pursue more effective learning strategies like help seeking. And I want to talk about, from my research, we had, this is about the role of instructors. So students said, even my professor told us that some people are just born that way with the mental outlook that's compatible with CS. They feel it's so easy for them. Yeah, he told the rest of the people that some of you will try, but you won't get it. It's just that your mental outlook isn't made that way. It's something you're born with. You can't help it. I sometimes will work. I think that this one, for people on this call, like I feel like this quote lands with them about like this immense power and potential for harm that faculty have in working with students and in telling them your challenge is not normal, your challenge is just evidence of innate ability. But one thing that I'll do when I'm working with faculty who believe in an innate ability for computer science or math, I might not change their mind, but I might be able to convince them that students will be better students if they have a growth mindset. So maybe I'm not going to change the faculty's ideas, but can I convince them that they should be trying to develop students' growth mindset? And sometimes I can make progress in that dimension. And sometimes I might not challenge their underlying beliefs. So here's an interesting study about, again, how impactful these faculty beliefs are. So this is looking at tons of students across 634 courses, 150 professors, and they surveyed the professors about their belief in innate ability. And then they grouped faculty into a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And then looked at students, so the light gray is students who had a faculty member that endorsed a growth mindset. How much did your instructor motivate you to do your best work? How much did the instructor emphasize learning and development? How likely will you be to recommend this course for this instructor? And then compared to your other courses, you've taken, how much time did this course require? And so these first three, we're seeing that there's statistically significant differences. And I think that even if you have a faculty member who endorses this fixed mindset, I think faculty still want to encourage students to do their best work. They still want students to learn and develop, and they still want students to give them good teaching evaluations. And so there are ways in which I think these data can motivate not just us as faculty members who believe in students' potential, but even if faculty believe in innate ability, that this might still motivate some change in the attitudes they present to students. Another piece of data from this one, and this is actually a graph, I remade their graph. So for Black, Hispanic, and Native American students, that's the light blue, and the dark blue is for white and Asian students. And this is looking at the gap in the course grade across the two. And the original image from theirs shows the error bars, so mine didn't have the error bars. And the error bars show you like a rough approximation, like these are statistically significant. But I made a different version of it with Black, Hispanic, and Native American because there's some pushback against this term underrepresented minority, or URM. Someone told me a student was like, when did I become an ERM? And I think it's important to think about the ways in which the minority, a lot of our schools and a lot of our contexts and soon our nation will be a minority white. And so the Black, Latinx, and Native students who are identified as underrepresented minorities, they're not a minority. So that part is sort of false. And then the second piece about minority is that it suggests less than in subtle ways. And so I think there's some pushback against that. I think as a community, often we're afraid of using racial language. And like the understanding and recognizing our own biases, I think sort of educating ourselves so that we feel comfortable talking about Black students and Latinx students and first generation college students, and getting comfortable talking about race so that we can be specific in our language and nuanced in our language, and not fall into sort of dehumanizing traps of like they're an where it's just like, oh, they're at a minimum they're an underrepresented minority. That captures more of like the humanness of their existence. More support for this idea of how important it is to believe students can succeed. So maybe people are familiar with stereotype threat. So Claude Steele looked at the ways in which students' performance and people's performance can sometimes conform to stereotypes about them if they are made to believe that their performance on that thing will be interpreted in terms of this stereotype. And so one of the strategies for addressing this is to make explicit for students that you have high expectations for them, and then make explicit that you believe that they'll be able to meet those high expectations. Okay, more questions. And in this pause for more questions, I also want you to be thinking about like, what are some things that you've heard from today or that today's talks have reminded you of that you might think of as an action item moving forward? Maybe in the next day, maybe in the next week, maybe in the next month, maybe in the next year. So
Can I mention something, Colleen?
Please, Pam.
Yes. Well, her talking about the growth mindset and what to do, here's a strategy you can also use from her today. Don't go into class and say, well, this is really simple or this is really easy, because that might be true for you, but if the student has trouble, that will get them to get discouraged of not staying in a program. So just something as simple as how you introduce a topic can be really defeating for students.
Totally. And I think, as a personal example, I want to acknowledge that I'm preaching to the choir and I'm telling people things they already know, but how has my language around, you probably know about stereotype threat, or you've probably heard of mindset, how has that impacted whether or not you like belong on this call? And so I think Pam, I like the emphasis on that, and maybe even these personal experiences on ways in which I've screwed this up on this call are helpful for you reflecting on this.
And you had talked about the growth mindset, and that was just really came to mind of walking in and saying, wow, today we're going to do something really simple. Doesn't always work for students.
Yeah, you think? And I think I tell students a lot of stories about where I had difficulty learning computer science. Like the first time I took the second semester computer science course, I nearly failed and I had to late drop it. The second time I took it, I got a 5 out of 25 on the first exam. And I push students to think, like, if you had been my friend at this time, like we're both 19, would you tell me not to study computer science? Would you tell me I'm not cut out for it? And I think that a lot of them can recognize that they might have. And that those setbacks and that difficulty that I experienced learning, it didn't mean that I could never learn it. It did mean that I didn't know it yet, but it didn't mean I could never learn it or would never learn it. And I love it. I think it's super, super fun. And I think it can help, like Pam was saying, make the world a better place. And so I use my own experience as an opportunity to challenge students to think about this growth mindset. And you're welcome to use my story. One of my friends is like, oh, and then there's Colleen's a professor at Harvey College, and so finding those stories to help challenge their ideas about innate ability, I think, are important. Other questions and comments?
Colleen, I have a question. This is Christina Titus. So my question is, the faculty that are kind of hesitant or reluctant to go with the growth mindset, is it possible that part of that hesitation is they don't want to admit that maybe there's errors in their teaching methods or in the way that they teach and such like that?
Totally. And I think that it's really important as we're doing this type of work to try and get behavior change and idea change, to recognize the ways in which we might be challenging people's core identity. Like, I'm an effective teacher, I'm a popular teacher, and then it might be identity threatening to encourage changes in practice. I might value in myself and might perceive a belief in my innate ability, and the extent to which you're challenging this idea maybe personally threatening to how I think of myself. And so I think this is really tricky to manage. I think it's easiest to do one-on-one where I can ask faculty for something in their teaching that they wish were improved. Do you know what I mean? So faculty have mentioned, oh, I noticed that a lot of women of color dropped my class. And so then we can talk about like, oh, by grounding it in something they are interested in, like I can get them to think about change in a different way. Or often faculty will report that maybe few students of color are coming to their office hours, and I think that there's often seeds of this that faculty are aware of that they might be interested in changing, and if you can try and get them to adopt practices that address that, it can be effective. Maybe you have other ideas though of how to sort of suppress this defensiveness or suppress this anxiety or perception of critique that can get in the way of changing practice. And maybe others do. And you're welcome to type it in if you'd rather not chat aloud. But.
Colleen, this is Anne. I wonder if some are just simply not willing, period.
Yeah. And so I find that everyone who's a teacher, I feel like on some level they care about their students, and as
Agreed.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes I can be worn down because students will just say stupid stuff on my teaching evaluations. Do you know what I mean? Where I'm like, you think you're upset it took me too long to get to you in office hours. Do you know what I mean? Like, there are always 30 people in my office hours. You're not the only human that matters. Do you know what I mean? And so then I just get frustrated with students, or they'll critique absurd things. And I think it's a really natural pattern where I find when students critique me, it's easier to distance myself. But I think it's really important in doing this work with teachers is to assume that they care about students, because I think somewhere they do. And then, and the extent to which we can humanize students can be helpful towards that. The extent to which so one thing that frustrates me about a lot of inclusive teaching workshops or stuff like that is they're like, okay, so take your course and change everything. And you're like, oh my gosh, like I barely have my head above water and you want me to change everything? And I think that there's ways in which in empathizing with what's currently on their plate and how many things they're juggling, and trying to think about what's a small change that they might make that might have high impact. One of the things I use is during class, just take a 2-minute break every 20 minutes. Set a timer, take a 2-minute break. Students learn more, students retain more. And it's something you can do that's likely to have differential impact for students with less preparation for your course. And it doesn't require any planning time for you. Do you know what I mean? And so I want to make recommendations for them that fit within the scope of their world and how much they have on their plate. And I think if they can get results from things like this, if they can get positive feedback from students, it can be really powerful. Sometimes I will talk to their students about, I think that this faculty would really love to hear that you think, that you think it would be helpful to, get to like pause to ask your question with a neighbor before you raise your hand, like to do a think, pair, share before, when they ask for questions, do a think, pair, share. And so sometimes I'll use students to try and help advocate for that, depending upon what I think will be most effective for the faculty member to be motivated to create change. Or thinking about other faculty members that faculty member is friends with or respects, and using that person as a role model for, I made these changes in my course and it wasn't a ton of time, and I got this positive feedback from students that these other people who might not be motivated might value. And I think Pam's point about patience, like it requires some patience, but I like this sort of gamification of it, to think about like, oh, who would best have impact on this person's decisions and behaviors. Other questions?
Those were really, really good comments, and I probably did not express it extremely well. One of the things we do talk about, though, is the WIFM. Everybody has to get what's in it for them.
Oh, yeah.
So identifying the motivation is sometimes a daunting task.
Yeah, and I think making recommendations only after you've had them tell you about their current context.
Right.
So
Good.
that they know you care that they're actually doing a lot of caregiving for a family member. You know what I mean? And that they have taken on this additional service role, so that it's easy for me to get feedback, and then for me to be like, you don't understand my context. And so the extent to which we're asking and listening and hearing people before we're dumping advice on them. I know that the webinar format is not that, but I think that empathizing can be important.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll keep going, but if we've got more questions or comments, and then Mark, do you have many minutes at the end that you'd like to wrap up with? How many minutes do you want me to save you?
Like 2.
Okay, I can for sure do 2. Okay. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about was actually just reinforcing this point that Pam made. So Pam was talking about helping students understand the opportunities of STEM to help society. And so this actually relates to some of my work that's with the Computing Research Association. This is another NSF-funded grant, and I work with the Center for Evaluating the Research Pipeline, or CERP, and they do a national survey of students. And one of the questions asked, how important to you is it that your career allows you to do each of the following: give back to my community, have a social impact, serve humanity, help others. So those are these communal goals. And the agentic goals are make a lot of money, work independently, make important decisions at work, and become well-known in my field. And, they're contrasted here, but students can have both agentic and communal goals. But there's broad patterns of students having communal goals, particularly who are underrepresented in STEM. So here's like the short version of those communal goals. And this is data from about 6,000 students in my sample who are computing majors or CS majors. And they answered those questions on a scale of 1, not at all, to 5, very much. And then if we look at these groups, male, female, white, Asian, Black, Latinx, continuing generation, so that's people who do have a parent or guardian with a 4-year college degree, or first generation college students, we see big gaps. And so female students are more likely to endorse communal goals than male, Asian, Black, and Latinx students more likely than white students, and first generation college students more likely than continuing generation college students to endorse communal goals. So the extent to which we can help students see computing as allowing them to pursue computing goals, or STEM in general to allow them to pursue these communal goals, can be differentially impactful for women, students of color, and first generation college students. And then we looked at that more specifically, and actually Amanda Diekman has looked at that. So this idea, perceived communal affordances, is on the top. So what they think of the field, communal orientation, like how much do they want to pursue communal goals, is on the bottom. In our survey, we said, to what extent would a career in computing allow you to serve humanity? And then Diekman's goal congruity theory is that if I have high communal orientation, I want to help society. So that's going to be women, students of color, and first generation college students are going to be more likely to have high communal orientation. I'm going to have high interests if I perceive high communal affordances of STEM, and a lower interest if I perceive low communal affordances of STEM. And Carol Diekman has seen that among women in their interest in STEM, and then my work looks at students' sense of belonging in computing, and we see this sort of differential pattern. This next graph is a little hard to make sense of, but because we're working in 3 dimensions, but let me talk you through it. So it's perceived communal affordances of computing, like what can computing offer, and then sense of belonging on the left, and these are all normalized so that the mean is 0, and then the 0.2 is 0.2 standard deviations. And then I have the circles are low communal orientation, and then the diamonds are high communal orientation. And then here are the slopes, and then I'll put that grid back on there. So what we're seeing is for students with high communal orientation, which are going to be more likely to be women, students of color, and first generation college students, there's a bigger positive impact of believing that computing allows you to pursue communal goals. So if you can see my mouse, for everyone, they have experienced a higher sense of belonging or report a higher sense of belonging if they think computing has communal affordances. And that is a steeper slope for students who have high communal orientation or want to help society. And so I think this is just like another piece of data to the points Pam was making about helping students see that that STEM fields can offer this possibility, because there's recent research, mine included, is suggesting that that's actually like really important and aligns with all the stuff Pam said. Okay, sorry, that was my my bonus, another piece of bonus piece. So now we've got 8 minutes for any questions or concerns or other things that I forgot to mention, and Mark's wrap up. And my email address is here on the slide, as is my Twitter handle.